So we're talking about Olympic lifestyle out of this passage and another passage we'll look at in a little bit. But unless you have been living out on a remote island somewhere without benefit of modern media, you know that we're in the Olympic frenzy right now. Many of us are probably spending way too much time glued to our television watching some of these events taking place down in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And if, like me, you're watching the things that are going on, you're watching the athletes in motion and in action, there's a tendency to think, boy, how easy it looks. Because they make it look incredibly easy, don't they? And we know it's not, because there was so much that went behind what they're doing, but we see their performance. Anyway, you watch that and you may have a tendency to be a bit inspired by what you see taking place, and so it might be enough to make you want to run out and go out to the gym and to get on the mats and to run up to the, I guess it's called the pommel horse, or the balance beam, the uneven bars, the rings, all those things, and release your inner athlete. Or seriously break or sprain something, as most of us would probably do. So probably it's not the wisest idea to try to do what they're doing. Thinking about the Olympics, and thinking about what the Apostle Paul writes that we look at here in just a moment, it is a possibility that the Apostle Paul may have been in Athens, Greece at one point in time to have witnessed one of the earlier Olympic events. So he may have actually seen an earlier version of what we're watching on TV today. Whether he was actually there or not, at least he was very familiar with another set of athletic games that were almost as popular, and I know I will have trouble pronouncing the word, but I think it's pronounced the Isthmian Games, that were held in the city of Corinth not every 4 years like the Olympics, but every 3 years. And so Paul, writing to the church at Corinth, they would have been very, very familiar with those games at the least, if not what became the modern Olympics out of Greece. So with their familiarity and Paul's familiarity, that became the backdrop for the words that we read in verses 24 to 27 out of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. But I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." Imagery that I think we're all familiar with, especially right now as we watch the Olympics. First of all, Paul talks about running in the race. And all run in the race, but only one gets the gold, so to speak. I guess you can get the silver and the bronze too. But only one gets the top prize. And so Paul says, why would you want to run, in essence, if you're not desiring to get the top prize? So he says, make it your aim. Make it your ambition, as he draws the parallel to the Christian life that we expand on here in a moment. Make it your aim to be the one that gets the prize. And so strive for the great prize. Verse 25, he talks about the utmost discipline and self-control that is required. And indeed it is. Again, right now, if we're watching the Olympics, we're seeing the result. We're seeing the fruit of discipline and self-control. We're seeing excellence, and we're seeing things that look so very, very easy. But again, how difficult, because they have worked long and hard to get to the point where they are right now. And so it is a tribute to their discipline and their self-control. And so Paul appeals to us in the Christian life. Make it also your ambition to be a disciplined individual, exercising self-control in your life, so that the Christian life, compared to a race, you may run that race, again, with excellence. Again, Paul talks about competing for a prize. He talks about competing for a prize that is perishable. When they ran the races, when they competed in the Olympics back in those days, it wasn't to get a gold or a silver or a bronze medal. The games that were held in Corinth, the one who won would receive a pine wreath. You're thinking, wow, a pine wreath, a branch off of a pine tree woven into a wreath, and that's all you get for all the hard work? Believe it or not, hard as it might be for us to understand, it was highly prized. It was something of value. And so if you won that, it was something that really meant something like the gold medal means today. But Paul says that was a perishable prize. We think about gold, silver, bronze. Those are perishable too, but not quite as perishable as a pine wreath would be. Paul says, think about the tremendous effort they put in just to get that prize. He says, think about what it is that we are striving for in our race. We're striving for something imperishable. And indeed, it causes us to pause and to think about what is it that we're in for? We're in for immortality. We're in it for life in the age to come. And so if those Olympic athletes can work so hard and strive for something that doesn't last and really isn't that valuable, what about us? Doesn't it appeal to us to strive with excellence because of the prize that's being offered to each one of us? Verses 26 and 27, Paul talks about two competitions in particular. He talks about running the race, and he talks about boxing. And he says, exercising discipline in both. I want to run in such a way that I receive the prize. I want to run straight line for the finish line. And he said, if I'm boxing, I don't want to just box aimlessly in the air. I want to box with purpose. I want to take out my opponent. I want to win the competition. And so he drives it on down to verse 27. I discipline my body, he says. Thinking about the athletic competitions, I discipline my body and I make my body my slave. Again, by the example of those athletes, I do so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Unthinkable that Paul would talk about control and discipline and those kinds of things and yet exercise none in his life. Who would believe what it is that he has to say? And so he says, so it is in our lives. Because there is a call to excellence, athletic excellence. And so we discipline ourselves. We exercise self-control so that we lift up an example rather than seeking to actually disqualifying ourselves by the way that we live in contrast to what it is that we preach. Having said those things, there's another great Olympic athletic passage I want us to turn over and look at this morning. One that I think many of us especially appreciate, Hebrews chapter 12. First three verses that follow the great Hall of Fame chapter, Hebrews 11. Chapter 12. Paul is considered the writer of Hebrews, although there's some question, but whoever the human author is, this is what God would say to us through this passage. Therefore, and of course that points us back to that great chapter of faith before that, all the outstanding examples of faith. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Again, thinking of the current Olympics, the example of the athletes. This passage refers to the athletic event of running a race. And so we are called and challenged to run a race and to run the race well. And we are given two key incentives for running the race. The first one is what we might call the grandstand crowd. No, they're not alive. They're not actually in the grandstands right now. They're dead. But Hebrews 11 reminds us of so many of them. Though they are dead, they still speak. And as we run the race today, as we live the Christian life today, it's as if figuratively they're in the grandstands and they're cheering us on by their example, saying, we ran the race, you run it too. You can run it because we did. And so they serve as a great example. And so we are given incentive through the grandstand crowd, the cloud of witnesses as they are called. And more importantly, we are given the incentive of Jesus, who also ran the race, and he ran it with excellence. The one who is the author and perfecter of the race. I think of Jesus in particular, the race that he ran. It's a far harder race than any of us will ever have to run. The thrill of victory for Jesus was set aside for the agony of the cross. Whatever we might go through will not begin to compare to the cross and what he had to endure. And it talks about looking to him and considering the example of the hostility of sinners that he faced. When I think of the hostility of sinners, I'm thinking about the road to Calvary. It's hard to think about it. It's hard to think about what he had gone through and what he went through at that time. He had suffered unbelievably. He had lost so much blood. He was in so much pain, and he's carrying the cross best as he could until he couldn't carry it any longer, carrying the cross up the hill, and not surrounded by those that supported him and encouraged him, but instead surrounded by hostility, those jeering at him, adding more insult to injury as he made his way up to the cross of Calvary where he would be crucified. And so he endured the hostility of sinners in his race. And so we are challenged to not lose sight of this Jesus. We're challenged to make sure that no matter what comes our way, we don't lose sight of him, that we keep our eyes fixed on him, and we continue to run the race, because as he ran it, we can run it too. We also can run it with excellence because of his example and because of his help. Going back to that first incentive that we have, the cloud of witnesses. I'm reminded of something that was done at this summer's general conference just about a month ago. And it's a little bit hard to talk about it, Joe, because these were our brothers. But a list was read of the pastors that we have lost to the enemy, death, in the 21st century, the last 16 years. And it was very, very sobering to hear that list of names read. Men who were very near and dear to us, especially who serve in pastoral ministry. And I was thinking back on the names that were read. And 3 of those names were men who pastored my home church. One of those men was the man that married Jill and I in marriage nearly 40 years ago. Another one was a very good friend from the time that we were on staff in Atlanta who was my age. Died very suddenly and quickly of cancer. And the list could go on and on. In fact, there was a prayer that was offered afterwards. And I thought about this passage because it was referred to, and it was a very touching moment for me because I could see the faces. I could see the faces of those faithful men as the prayer was prayed. And I thought about the fact that those men their names are now among the cloud of witnesses. And so those of us today who press on in the race, who've got that many more that are in the cloud of witnesses, yet their example says, we ran the race with excellence. You keep on running the race with excellence. Be encouraged by our example. And we are. I'm personally encouraged by their example, but I'm encouraged by the many examples in Scripture and others who have lived so faithfully that I have personally known throughout the years. The grandstand crowd, the cloud of witnesses around us, encourage us. Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, also encourages us. And again, we're challenged to make sure not to lose sight of him in particular, because if we do so, the very last of the third verse says, we run the risk of growing weary and losing heart. And we don't want that to happen, do we? We want to make sure that we don't burn out. We want to make sure that we are not totally disheartened where we turn clear away from the faith. And so again, we listen to the cheers figuratively of the cloud of witnesses. We fix our eyes without blinking on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. But there is a tendency, there is a temptation to grow weary and to lose heart. And we all know that we all struggle from time to time. None are immune to difficulties and struggles. In fact, I think about a comment my dad made years ago, and I think it's right. He says, anybody that tells you that they're living on top of the world, living the victorious Christian life, is not being honest with you. I think that's right. I've run into some that would pretend and say that. How's everything going? Fine, fantastic, couldn't be better. Well, when's your downtime? Because everybody has it. That's the reality. There are times when we become weary and we might lose heart. We struggle. We have those times in life, and I'm certainly here to tell you that I am no exception. I have my seasons as well, times when I become weary and burdened and downtrodden. Growing weary and losing heart is a very real personal struggle for me, as it is for every one of us in this room. But again, I go back to the cloud of witnesses. I think we all must do that. The cloud of witnesses that by example speak to us. And again, resolute focus on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. In particular, I think of the cloud of witnesses, and there are certain individuals that are more encouraging than others. And I know he's not named in Hebrews chapter 11, but he certainly is prominent in Scripture, and he's a great encourager, the prophet Elijah. Certainly a familiar name to many of us. And Elijah knew what it was like to potentially grow weary and to lose heart. 1 Kings chapter 18, you're probably very familiar with the story. He never stood taller in all of his life than a particular instance where he did battle with some false prophets of Baal in a place called Mount Carmel. And an amazing thing happened up there. The story goes that he said, well, you guys build your altar. You call down fire from heaven to prove you're God, and I'm going to build one over here to Yahweh God. I'll call fire down. And so those false prophets danced around all day and cut themselves and were bleeding all over the place. And they worked themselves into a frenzy, and surprisingly enough, their God never answered. But the story goes that Elijah poured water around that altar, poured lots of water around it. He prayed to Yahweh God, and he called upon him, and God brought fire down and consumed the altar and astonished everyone present. And the false prophets were led off, and they were killed. And there was great victory. You'd think that's the end of the story. A great victory. But there's another little chapter that we might find encouraging. In fact, turn over to 1 Kings 19 to just look at a couple of verses, because I think we can relate to what we read there. And many times it is true that on the heels of victory comes times of challenge. We might look in our own lives and say some things that happened that were notable successes and say, how come it's so tough right now? Many times there is a time of discouragement that follows a time of victory. So verses 3 and 4, well, to back up a little bit, the first two verses, Queen Jezebel has basically issued a threat. Even though he stood up to hundreds of false prophets, the queen issues this little threat. Basically, I'm going to make you like those that were killed. So she's kind of issued a death threat to him. Verse 3, it says, and he was afraid and arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, it is enough now, O Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. You get the picture? Here's a man who is very much afraid. Mighty prophet of God, granted, but he's human. A man who is afraid, who is tired, and he sounds rather, well, shall we say, suicidal. I'd just as soon die. He wasn't taking measures to kill himself, so that's good. But nevertheless, here's a man who is losing heart, becoming discouraged. I love what follows. If you read the rest of the story, if you know the rest of the story there, God stepped in. God fed him. God hydrated him. And God appeared to him in a miraculous way. Well, there's the part of the story, so I wish he'd do that for me too. Maybe he doesn't always operate quite that way with us. But he gave him some significant work to do, namely go off and anoint a certain individual to be a king and anoint a replacement prophet for you, because Elijah's an old man. And the important thing is he reminded Elijah that he was not alone. That there were 7,000 people that he didn't know about, because Elijah's claim was, well, I'm the only one left. Everybody else has forsaken you, God. I'm the only one left. God says, nope, you're mistaken, to paraphrase what's said here. I got 7,000 faithful ones who are like-minded, who are in partnership with you and serving me, Yahweh God, and be encouraged in knowing that fact. Elijah then stands out in the cloud of witnesses because he knew what it was like to be weary, to lose heart. But we see this chapter where God worked with him. And so that example speaks to us. God works with us to make sure that we are not discouraged as well. Again, some names not listed specifically in Hebrews 11, but these are names that I fully believe are in the cloud of witnesses, namely Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They are also part of the cloud of witnesses. And I want to share a few things about them because a very timely devotional thought was shared with me this past Friday, Jeff, thank you, that brought me some real encouragement and brought me a different perspective than I had considered before. And I had, this is good stuff. I need to share that with you this morning. So you know the story of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus in John chapter 11. You know the story about Lazarus, the younger brother of the two sisters, who became very, very ill at death's door, and eventually who did die, but yet was miraculously raised from the dead by Jesus. But of course his sisters didn't know how the thing was going to turn out. And so Lazarus, their younger brother, is deathly ill, literally. And so they are deeply concerned. And we might also preface that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, we're told, were some of Jesus' closest friends. And that may be one a little bit difficult to think about. Jesus, the Son of God, had certain friends he was closer to than others. Yeah, he did. And these were among his closest friends. And so there was no doubt with the two sisters that Jesus loved every one of them. And so in the time of Lazarus' serious illness, they sent out an urgent appeal. An urgent appeal to Jesus. And this is the focus of what we want to consider for a few moments. John 11, verse 3. The basis for their appeal was, "He whom you love is sick." The one that you love is sick. I want you to hang on to that verse for a moment. I want to share with you some of these devotional thoughts and consider a perspective that I think can be real helpful. The realization that welled up from deep within Mary and Martha's hearts, I should say that was what welled up within their hearts, was this thing that Jesus loved them. Jesus loved Lazarus. It wasn't their love for Jesus or Lazarus' love or his good deeds that moved Jesus. It was pointless to recite a laundry list of their brother's achievements. That wasn't what moved the heart of Jesus. It was his own love that motivated him. It was his own desire to bless and to heal and restore. The message Mary and Martha sent was a plea, a prayer. And notice the basis of their prayer, the one you love. You can find out a lot about what you really believe when you listen to yourself pray. When you listen to what you say in the heat of the moment. How many times, the writer says, have I prayed prayers like this? Oh God, I need help. I'm faithful. I help people. I'm generous. I'm holy. I read my Bible. And I'm praying really, really loudly with big words and Bible verses and lots of praise. So come, Lord, and help me with my need. In other words, Lord, based on what I've done, now please do. We think that moves God. No, what moves God is His Son. The writer continues, I was tired the other afternoon, maybe not a big deal, but I had some things I had to accomplish that evening and I really needed strength. So I got alone for a few moments and I said, Lord, the one you love is tired. Give me energy. It was such a refreshing, healthy way to pray. It was incredible. I started thinking, that was crazy. That felt good. That's far better than trying to talk God into something based on our own works or our own merit. Nobody's an outsider when we pray this way. It's on the basis of His love, not ours. I want to testify that led me into a transforming moment. Because I've never prayed the way that writer described, but I did. I want to tell you the difference it made at the moment. I got honest before the Lord and I said, Lord, the one you love is kind of weary. Lord, the one you love is kind of discouraged. Lord, the one you love just needs some emotional, physical, and spiritual strength. And I prayed like like that was suggested. Not on the basis that, God, I'm your servant. You know, I'm a pastor. I've been at it for years. And you ought to cut me a little break here. It wasn't on that basis. That's an easy way to go. It was on the basis of, I know that you love me, just like you did Lazarus. And on the basis of the fact that I know you love me, I just want to pray this and tell you this. It was absolutely transforming. It was an amazing moment. That's going to change the whole direction of prayer. And following that, I pray for certain of you each day of the week, Monday through Friday. So I prayed for those of you on my Friday prayer list. And I prayed that way. You know, he whom you love. I know this is going on. I'm asking for prayer and help along those lines. And I prayed for each of you that way. And I will continue to do so starting tomorrow, praying for each of you along those lines. Praying for those of you whom Jesus loves. Okay, now maybe that sounds like a bit of a diversion on what we were talking about at the start here in terms of Olympic lifestyle. What's any of that got to do with it? I think it's got everything to do with it. The one that we are to fix our eyes upon considers every one of us the same way as Lazarus, the one whom he loves. It's a simple thought, but it's a very important thought. The one whom he loves, the one who loves us, is the one that we are to fix our eyes on. So with that thought in mind, we need to live our lives like the Olympic athlete who strives for the gold medal to be the only one who wins. To discipline our lives like an athlete so that we do not disqualify the message that we preach by the way that we live. That we run with endurance. The race that is not a sprint, but it is a marathon. We run the race in its duration. That we are encouraged by the cloud of witnesses that surround us. And again, Jesus, who's already run the race with great excellence. And knowing that we will indeed grow totally weary and totally lose heart if we don't keep focused on the cloud of witnesses and Jesus, our example before us. And so those thoughts, I believe, all tie together. But again, I want to come back to that phrase, the one whom you love is sick. As I found that to be transformational in my life this week, I thought it would be good to give an opportunity for it to be so in your life. So before we leave this place today, as we sing a song in just a couple moments, I want to do this. I want to offer that prayer for you as it meant so much to me if you are willing and desiring to do so. So I think this is a call to prayer as we close out the service this morning. That if you want to have me pray for you in that way, as I would like to, just tell me what it is that you who are loved by Jesus want prayed for, and I will do that.